You're listening to Simply Put, a podcast from FHN Financial. I'm your host, Will Compernell. President Trump nominated former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh to be the next Fed chair later this year. Warsh's perspective on rate policy has been fluid recently, but he has consistently advocated for reducing the Fed's balance sheet and changing the way the central bank approaches its public communication. Warsh is set to lead an FOMC that is already divided on how to interpret current economic conditions, making the task of building consensus and implementing any desired changes that much more difficult. On today's episode, we talk with George Pearkes, macro strategist at Bespoke Investment Group, about what Kevin Warsh's experience can tell us about his policy views, how much influence he'll have over the rest of the FOMC, and what his tenure could mean for the direction of interest rates in the years ahead. Stay tuned. Coming up soon, our interview with George Pearkes, but first, a quick market update. The Federal Reserve left interest rates unchanged last week, as expected. The policy statement and press conference offered essentially no forward guidance, and the Treasury market showed barely any reaction. Chair Powell is set to preside as chair for 2 more Fed meetings before Kevin Warsh would take over in mid-June, assuming his confirmation process goes smoothly. Warsh's candidacy is the subject for today's episode. Treasury's quarterly refunding announcement showed coupon auction sizes will remain unchanged for the next few quarters, as was widely expected. The statement did tweak the forward guidance to say they are still looking into auction size increases down the line. Most analysts expect issuance for coupon treasuries to increase in either the fourth quarter of this year or the first quarter of 2027. The federal government was partially shut down for a few days this week as congressional reps worked out disagreements over funding for the Department of Homeland Security. The macro impacts should be minimal, but government data releases set for publication this past week have been delayed, including the January jobs report. The absence of government data placed outsized attention on this week's private sector releases. The ISM manufacturing came in much stronger than expected, though the survey's author noted much of the rise in new orders stemmed from firms looking to front-run potential new tariffs. January car sales were the lowest in almost 3 years, most likely reflecting the effects of cold weather dampening demand. ADP reported private sector payrolls grew a meager 22,000 last month, and the ISM services was unchanged at 53.8. The Treasury market took these developments in stride, staying range-bound over the last 2 weeks outside a brief rally last Friday that continued into early Monday morning. The ISM manufacturing unwound the overly bullish pricing. Tenure yields are testing support at 4.28% as of writing, and the bond market is not fully pricing in the next Fed rate cut until its July meeting. That's all for the market update this time. Now, our interview with George Pearkes. Our guest today is George Pearkes, macro strategist at Bespoke Investment Group. George, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Will. I appreciate it. Great to be here.
Our topic today is Kevin Warsh, how President Trump's nominee for the next Fed chair could shape monetary policy in the years ahead. George, to start things off, tell us about Warsh's formal credentials. From a resume perspective, what experience does he bring to the position of Fed chair?
So Warsh is a very interesting character in the sense that he has both a fair bit of experience on the FOMC compared to some of the other folks that were being considered by President Trump. And he's also someone whose lack of experience in the past has been something of a red flag. So to be more specific, when he was first nominated to the FOMC in a governor's position that he held from 2006 to 2011, there was criticism that he was not experienced enough and didn't have a resume for the job. He had a background in the financial sector, but beyond that, he was not an academic economist or someone with a long experience in financial markets or economic policymaking. So there were concerns from the Republican side of the aisle at the time that he would not have what it took to be a governor. And so it's sort of a mixed bag. You can frame it as him being inexperienced and not having the formal kind of resume that you would want to see from a central banker, even though he spent time on the FOMC before. Or you could say, look, he's been on the FOMC, so he's been in those rooms and has 5 years of experience with the policymaking committee, which is more than could be said for someone like, for instance, Kevin Hassett, or Rick Reeder, who is another finalist candidate for the chair job.
From those years as Fed governor, but also just by staying in the public sphere with his media appearances and op-eds, he's provided a pretty extensive track record for his thoughts on policy. So is he a hawk, a dove, someone in between? And do you think his past views are a reliable indicator for what he'll do as Fed chair?
I would say that his past views have established him not as a hawk or as a dove, but as a poor forecaster and someone that is not reliable in terms of their outlook on what's going to happen next for the economy and for the market. There are times when he is dovish, when he should be hawkish, and there are times when he's hawkish and he should be dovish. And it's rare that he is in the right posture relative to the economy as a whole. I'll get into a little more detail with that, I think, because it's helpful to understand the context. In 2007, he gave a speech talking about the high levels of liquidity in the financial system, the evolution in derivatives pricing that was allowing risk transfer to be taking place much more efficiently, and the high levels of confidence in the strength and integrity of our financial infrastructure, markets, and laws. That was about 3 or 4 months before things really started heating up with the global financial crisis. And within 18 months, we were in the worst recession since the Great Depression because of the financial sector. So that's an example of a time when he took an ideologically motivated line. There was a wide, not entirely partisan, but widespread consensus in the 1990s and 2000s from former Fed Chair Alan Greenspan, from various officials in the Clinton administration, from Republicans in other policymaking roles, and from some other Democrats as well, that efficient markets and the innovations of derivatives and various different approaches to financial markets that had ballooned since the 1980s would prevent the sort of catastrophe that we had seen in, for instance, the Great Depression, when a financial crisis metastasized into a broader economic downturn. And that all obviously was just flatly wrong. That was untrue. It was inaccurate. It was not the case. And the result was the global financial crisis. In the wake of the global financial crisis, Warsh was convinced that the large Fed balance sheet was going to lead to hyperinflation. It was going to lead to a variety of bad macroeconomic outcomes that straightforwardly did not play out. There are all sorts of pieces of evidence that QE, quantitative easing, i.e. the expansion of the Fed balance sheet, works in relatively benign ways on the economy. It does have an impact on the economy, but it is not as simple as the old Milton Friedman license plate equation, PY equals MV, which is basically saying that if you raise the volume of money in the system, if you raise by doing QE, that you will necessarily create inflation. And so that whole line of thinking was very wrong in 2010, 2011, when he was espousing it from within the FOMC. He also was hawkish throughout more recent economic history, but strangely pivoted to being much more aggressively dovish and calling for rate cuts in roughly November of 2024. I'm not sure if anyone remembers if there was some event that took place then. So the concern with Warsh is not that he's a hawk or that he's a dove, but that he is going to be ideologically motivated in how he steers the FOMC, how he communicates to markets in ways that will potentially create problems. And in that respect, he is not what I would describe as a good candidate to run the US central bank.
I want to give him some credit, or just the idea of being wrong in these big macroeconomic scenarios. So the Powell Fed has made some incorrect predictions as well. They did a mid-cycle adjustment right before the pandemic when they realized that the unemployment rate could get lower without causing any worrisome inflationary pressures. I think also inflation during the pandemic turned out to not be transitory in the way that they had characterized it. Yes, it was this phenomenon that would eventually go away, but I don't think that's really how they were predicting it would happen in 2020 and 2021. And more recently, Fed governors Chris Waller and Mickey Bowman have gone from hawkish to dovish, and they've given us a pretty good idea of what's behind their change in perspective. So I want to just give some credence to the idea that people can change their minds and it's okay, not everyone's predictions are right, but has Warsh given us any idea of why he was a hawk as recently as September 2024? And then to your point, after this election in November 2024, he suddenly supports big rate cuts. How does he explain that change?
He doesn't effectively. I mean, he doesn't do it in a way that actually offers a conclusive takeaway that would justify that shift. At least he doesn't, in my opinion. Now, I will say, being a central banker is incredibly difficult. Whether you are a member of the FOMC, whether you're a member of the Fed staff, whether you're the chair, no one expects anyone to get every call right. I think the Powell Fed is a really good example of this. The mid-cycle adjustment that they did in 2019 was a really good example of changing their minds in ways that they tried to limit the spillover effects from. They ran tight policy a little bit tighter than they actually needed to, and so they ramped back. After the COVID shock, I think it was very easy to replay the concerns from the global financial crisis in 2008. And nobody, for instance, saw the shock from global commodity markets that was delivered by Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine in the wake of that inflation shock. The post-pandemic inflation that we saw was in large part, not entirely, but roughly 50-50, I think is probably where consensus on this, driven by supply factors versus demand factors. And some of those supply factors really were black swans that no one could have forecasted. The difference, I think, between getting a macro call wrong and behaving in a way that suggests you're a poor forecaster is having a framework that is responsive to what's going on and understanding what you've gotten wrong in the past. And I don't see any evidence of that from Warsh. Like minds may disagree, but that is my concern with him as the chair of the FOMC, is that he's going to go down blind alleys motivated by politics or by bad forecasting that could create harm. Now, I will say, to moderate that criticism on my part, he's just one member of the committee. I think it's easy to think of the chair as the president because they're the one that addresses the media 8 times a year after FOMC meetings. They are certainly the first among equals. They are the chief executive of the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors. But in actual fact, in terms of both setting rate policy and making other policy decisions within the Federal Reserve, the chair has much less power than that set of sort of trappings would indicate. So personally, I don't see the appointment of Warsh as chair to be some sort of massive macroeconomic risk. I think it changes the composition and focus of the FOMC at the margin, and there could have been a better pick there. But I also don't think it's going to lead to massive inflation or a series of significant policy errors, because the FOMC and the Board of Governors both function as a committee, and there are other very sober and careful and diverse thinkers on both of those committees that will moderate any impetus that Warsh may have towards pursuing a more politically minded agenda.
I want to follow up on that in just a bit, but I want to come back to some of his non-Fed funds perspectives. So he has said that he wants to see regime change at the Fed. I don't really know what that means, but to go to your point about forecasting and models, he said that the Fed is too data dependent. Data is backward looking. We need to be more forward looking. But I think, as Powell pointed out at the last press conference, if you have better models, bring them on. We are willing to entertain them. And so if Warsh is not going off of data, what is his model for the economy? Is it vibes? What is he going to take as his directive for where policy should go?
I just don't see good evidence that he has an operative model. And I think Chair Powell's comments at the last FOMC meeting were very welcome, and he's right. You can criticize the Powell Fed for a number of things. I think your point that the inflation forecast in the early aftermath of the pandemic was off is a fair criticism. Where I think you have to pump the brakes on criticism around the Powell Fed is arguing that they are hidebound or not open to new ideas or somehow buried in academic economic modeling that isn't appropriate for the real world. I mean, keep in mind that Chair Powell himself is not an academic economist, and there are a number of FOMC officials who are not either. I think a lot of the focus on staying away from being data dependent is a pretext and an effort to find a justification to cut rates, as opposed to some sort of actual model for how the economy works. I think if we had a different person in the White House right now, I think Warsh would be singing a very different tune. And that's what his past statements lead us to believe. So, again, none of this is a catastrophe. None of this is sort of a concern that the Fed has been absolutely captured and we'll see monetary policy subordinate to the White House because, again, Warsh is just one of the members of the FOMC and Board of Governors. And without broad buy-in from those bodies, even if Warsh's model for the economy is simply political and therefore badly biased, there's a limit to how much damage can be done with that. What I would be much more concerned about is Warsh considering himself to have a mandate to reform and fundamentally change how the FOMC and the Board of Governors operates by, to use a metaphor, ripping the copper pipes out of the wall. I don't think Warsh will go along with that, even if the president gets very mad at him for not cutting rates enough or gets very mad at the FOMC at large for not cutting rates enough. And that was a concern I did have with Hassett. So I really do think Warsh was a better pick than we could have seen hypothetically.
Another part of Fed policy that he clearly has a track record of being critical of is balance sheet management. He thinks the Fed's balance sheet is too big. Now, you can argue pro or con, but the balance sheet size is what it is right now. Here we are in 2026. The Fed just started to do its reserve management purchases to ease some pressures in money markets. So what can Warsh do as the chair if he wants this regime change? Do you think we could see a much smaller Fed balance sheet, or was that a lot of talk that he could just reverse? I mean, in the same way that he reversed his perspective on short-term rate policy.
I suspect what's going to happen is that Warsh is going to come in and get a full briefing from the Fed staff, talk with the staff, especially at the New York Fed, who are incredibly professional and incredibly plugged into the markets that they help manage. And it'll be made clear to him that if you want to significantly shrink the Fed balance sheet, we have to completely rethink how bank liquidity works in this country. Right now, there is an enormous balance of reserves. So recall that reserves are assets held by banks. They're a liability of the Fed. Only banks can hold reserves. There's an enormous balance of reserves that are held because of liquidity preferences and regulatory requirements for the banking sector. That has nothing to do with the Fed choosing an arbitrary level for its balance sheet and trying to inflate the economy by maintaining that. You can argue that it may be distortionary, but if you want to reduce that level of reserves, which is what shrinking the balance sheet would necessarily entail, you're going to either create a lot of negative side effects in terms of illiquidity in repo markets and other short-term funding markets, or you need to change how banks are managing their liquidity somehow. I am skeptical that Warsh will be able to orchestrate that sort of cross-agency, really global effort to shift how the dollar banking system manages its liquidity. It's possible. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I am just very suspicious that it's going to be worth anyone's time to do when the more status quo option, which is to allow the New York Fed to just manage the balance sheet so that liquidity doesn't get out of control and keep the balance sheet roughly at the same size it is now relative to the financial system and the economy and go from there. Now, I will say there are ideas about managing the short-term interest rate environment that the Fed does to set policy that don't come from Warsh and that are interesting and worthy of discussion. Lloyd Logan, the Dallas Fed president, had a speech last year talking about moving the target rate away from the Fed funds market and towards the repo market. I think there are really reasonable discussions to be had there, and there would be implications for the size of the Fed's balance sheet and how it manages its balance sheet in that process. So that's one potential path they could go down. But I don't really see that as a simple switch that can be flipped. It's going to be part of a much longer process unless Warsh is comfortable setting off a series of major liquidity events, which I really, really doubt he is.
How do you think the bond market views this nomination? I mean, we've had about 2 trading sessions since the announcement was made officially, and moves in the Treasury market. When I look at the moves for most benchmark tenors, it doesn't seem like the nomination had much of an effect at all. So, do you think bond investors are kind of cautiously optimistic or really relieved with Warsh as a pick? I mean, I know it doesn't come as a total surprise, so maybe it was already priced in.
I think the bond market in general is taking the view that Warsh is one member of 2 committees and that he may have an impact on those committees, but that it will be marginal as opposed to wholesale, right? And I think that is the correct read from the bond market. I think if we get into a situation where there is some sort of effort to, for instance, move rate setting policy from the FOMC to the Board of Governors by changing the rate that the that the Board of Governors targets for monetary policy. If there's some sort of indication that the Board of Governors is going to sort of rip control over monetary policy away from the FOMC that has those moderating influences of a regional Federal Reserve president on it, I think you might see a very different approach there. And that is one of the hypothetical fears in terms of how the White House could exercise control over monetary policy. That sort of outcome is a very down the road one. It's one that a lot of contingencies have to hit to bring into play. And I don't see any indication right now that Warsh is someone who would bring those contingencies into play. So again, as I said previously, and as I think the bond market is indicating, the Fed chair is not the one who sets interest rates. It's just that's not how it works. There's a committee that sets interest rates with a very, very diverse range of views on it, very, very diverse range of backgrounds, lots of debate. If you've ever listened to a recent Fed press conference, you know that Chair Powell is careful to emphasize how much disagreement there is within the FOMC because they don't all have the same ideas about how everything works and what the appropriate path for monetary policy is. That includes folks like Michelle Baumann, Vice Chair Baumann, who is a Trump appointee and will be the longest tenure Board of Governors member when Powell steps off. It's true of Waller. It's true of someone like Elisa Cook or Richard Jefferson. It's true of regional central bank presidents as well. There's just all sorts of diversity of opinion across the FOMC. And that's incredibly valuable because it helps you avoid a situation where one person's ideological bias or temperamental bias or poor models or poor forecasting ability ends up wrecking it for everybody else. So I think the bond market is right to be basically blasé about this appointment. And I think the focus on the chair as the only one who sets policy is the wrong way to figure out what bond investors are thinking.
So let's go down into that hypothetical scenario where Warsh really is just one of 12 FOMC voters, and he isn't able to build the consensus of the committee like we saw with Powell, Yellen, and Bernanke. Now, I think that if nothing else, the tenure of those chairs was helpful for investors because instead of triangulating 12 different voters' thoughts, you could listen to what the chair said, especially at a press conference, and know that they were basically speaking for the median participant. If Warsh doesn't command that same leadership, could it make it very confusing for investors who really suddenly have to start tallying votes in the intermediate period, and we'll see a lot more dissents like the Bank of England has, where suddenly some policy decisions could be 7-5.
I don't think it's a necessarily done deal that we head down that road, but it's certainly one path that could follow. I think it's entirely possible that the fears I have over a politicized chair end up being ameliorated by the very professional and thoughtful staff at the Federal Reserve and other FOMC colleagues of Chair Warsh when he's ultimately appointed or ultimately confirmed by the Senate. So, I think there is a path there where he comes in and sort of gets sat down and starts getting briefed properly and, realizes, look, these are thoughtful people and we don't need to, pushing some sort of ideologically motivated monetary policy is not going to work. So let's try and learn the lessons that we have seen taught by Bernanke, by Yellen, by Powell, and become a wrangler of the FOMC and a shepherd as opposed to a director of that body. I think on the other hand, if Warsh does come in and start saying, okay, this is what we're going to do, it's not going to go well for him. He's not going to get the votes to do that. The current composition, both of the regional Federal Reserve Bank presidents and the rest of the Board of Governors don't support that sort of imperial chair approach, especially if it's viewed as being somehow directed by politics. So if we do go down the road of what Dario Perkins has referred to as BOE-ification of the Federal Reserve, then I think it's going to get a lot more exciting from day to day counting votes. It's going to be more like doing whip counts of a bill in the House or Senate, as opposed to the more staid approach that FedSpeak has taken over the past few decades. So I can't be highly confident either way, but I do think the scenario you describe, where we start looking a lot more like the BOE and have a lot more dissents and a lot more open debate in public, is certainly possible. And we'll just have to see how it plays out.
I want to then give another argument for kind of some safeguard against the idea that we're going to have runaway inflation. It's just really hard to view this nomination outside the context of these fears of the Fed's political independence. But I don't think it's so simple as a highly partisan Fed chair is going to mean lower Fed funds now at the expense of higher inflation later, which means higher long-term yields. And my thinking here is, a hypothetically partisan chair could be neutral for yields long term, in that they're overly dovish when one party is in power and overly hawkish when the other party's in power. And this isn't the best way to run monetary policy, of course, but it could offset some of the bias towards lower rates in the short run. And so even if we have the most pessimistic view of Warsh possible, that he is a more powerful Fed chair than just one of 12 voters, in that scenario, they would be really restrictive when the opposition party's in power, and long-term yields could come under check.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, ultimately, I just don't think that the structure of the FOMC will allow an extreme version of that. I mean, I think all else equal, if the chair is pushing for tighter policy because of politics, then we do have this scenario where you go from very dovish to very hawkish, depending on who's in the White House. But again, I'm not sure that's going to be how it plays out in practice, because there are committee structures for setting these rates. And, another thing I'll say about Warsh is that he is in the spectrum of the contemporary Republican Party. He is not a MAGA true believer. He's somebody who has a long history in Republican Party politics, but he also has lots of contacts in the financial industry, lots of contacts across the sort of conservative political sphere, in a way that offers negative feedback loops to truly bad policy that I think might not have been true with other nominees. And so I really think that there are a series of checks or negative feedback loops that will make implementing a hawkish when a Democrat is in the White House, dovish when a Republican is in the White House approach to policy from the actual setting of rates, as opposed to what Warsh thinks or says, very hard to implement. And it may be that he ultimately, we basically end up ignoring the Fed chair for a while. That's certainly possible. Or again, it may be that he comes in and sort of says, okay, now that I've gotten the job, I can do what we need to do in practice, as opposed to what's necessary in rhetoric or what I promised the president, and I'll go from there. I will say, too, in the background of all this, we have the DOJ investigation into Chair Powell, and we have the effort to remove Governor Cook from her position, that oral arguments that is before SCOTUS right now. And both of those processes have generated pretty strong pushback from the respective checks on them. So, for instance, we're talking about Warsh, but he can't get nominated and confirmed by the Senate until the DOJ investigation into Chair Powell is dropped. And, we're talking about the Board of Governors changing composition or falling in behind the chair. But the Supreme Court looks very likely to back the idea that you need really, really different facts from what we have about Governor Cook to remove a governor from the Board of Governors. And so if that's the case, that the Senate is acting as a check, even just one senator in the case of Tom Tillis, who has promised to freeze nominations through the Senate Banking Committee, and also from the Supreme Court, it just adds more negative feedback loops to this downside of hyperpartisan monetary policy that I think weren't necessarily guarantees if you had sat here and looked at it 6 or 9 months ago.
So let's assume that his nomination does get through. He becomes the Fed chair for at least 4 years. Let's end with your most optimistic scenario and most pessimistic scenario for a Warsh Fed. And let's start with pessimistic so we end on a slightly happier note. But within the, plausible range of outcomes, what do you think is the most pessimistic scenario?
I think the most pessimistic scenario I view as reasonably possible would be Warsh becoming effectively a dead letter, and the comments of the chair misleading markets relative to what's actually happening on the committee. That could lead to some much higher volatility, much higher risk premiums for interest rates, in effect, steepening the curve, steepening the term premium, both at the short end and the long end, because the path of rates is so much less predictable based on reading the tea leaves of the FOMC, and you get mixed messages and so on and so forth. So that would be my sort of pessimistic outcome. I think you could add as a potential contingent one on that, if we have some sort of major crisis, and by major crisis I mean something on the order of the GFC or the COVID shock, and the Fed chair is not credible. That's a big problem because they're going to be doing a lot of very important communication around what's coming down the pipe from monetary policy to deal with whatever that crisis is. So I think that's sort of the worst case scenario.
I want to reinforce that idea because to me, I think that that's really under discussed right now. We're so focused on the path of short term rates that, you forget that the Fed chair, as this quasi political leader, is the executive of a really big institution. And so look at the financial crisis or March of 2020. Bernanke and Powell realized that it wasn't just, okay, we should move policy to the zero lower bound. You had to have this backing of a massive institution in order to do really big things quickly. You also had to have good partnerships with people in and outside of government. And I know Warsh, when people talk about his experience in the financial crisis, his Wall Street connections were helpful, I guess, in supporting a lot of those banks. But what I worry about the most is that if a crisis comes, he is just going to be caught flat-footed, and I don't even know if that's about him specifically. It's just that not everyone is natural in this position. When I read about Bernanke's timeline during the financial crisis, he was a brilliant academic who eventually won the Nobel, but he had to learn how to be an executive of this big institution. And I think, to Powell's credit, he has forged really good relationships in Congress and with the rest of the Fed. And there's just always a risk when the crisis comes, Warsh might not be able to meet the moment.
Yes, I agree. I mean, and again, I don't say what I said there to say Warsh will not be able to meet the moment. It's just something I would have as a potential concern based on his past statements, his past behavior, his experience. And as a general principle, those sorts of extreme outcomes require very capable people to handle them. We were very lucky to have Chair Powell and Chair Bernanke at the reins of the Federal Reserve when those crises hit in 2007, 2008, and in 2020. And if you had just put in a replacement level central banker, I think it would have gone quite differently. This is not personal to Warsh, but I do think that that's a potential risk. On the other hand, if you look at the relationships he has with the private sector, I think there's good evidence to suggest that if he's really getting something wrong, there will be a course correction. He will get feedback on it that is not just coming from the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And I think that there will be feedbacks to him that help him learn and shift policy if there are mistakes being made. So I don't want to paint that as necessarily a locked in terrible outcome, but it's something I worry about. On the more optimistic side, I will say I think there's a very good chance that Warsh comes in, as I described earlier, sits down with the Fed staff, sits down with other members of the FOMC, starts getting a feel for the institution, and says, okay, regardless of what I said previously, these are hardworking people doing their jobs as best they can, and they're quite good at their jobs. To quote Chair Powell from his last FOMC press conference, I mean, this is one of the most impressive groups of people that he's ever come across. In fact, the most impressive. And no one who works at the FOMC or works at the Federal Reserve should think that anything other than this is the best group of people you're ever going to work with in your career. So I think there is a very real chance that he comes in, starts getting a feel for what his new day-to-day is going to be like and the people supporting it, and his attitude starts to change relative to the sort of worst case scenarios I've laid out over the past half hour or so.
I think that's right because it's really easy to be a critic on the sidelines, but at the end of the day, this is his own lifetime reputation at stake, and no one wants to be known as the Fed chair that gave up its political independence or caused inflation to get out of control. I also think that his experience in markets could make him very connected to, as you said, what private investors are saying, needs to be done. So he's not going to make any drastic decisions if it means that the bond market is going to freak out. Another important thing to add, I believe, is that let's just be realistic that people will say a lot of things to be nominated to the Federal Reserve, to the Supreme Court, to a lot of positions. And then once you're in the position, you moderate a lot of those views. And so it might just be that he was angling to get the nomination, and he's going to be a lot more level-headed than some of the most pessimistic scenarios that we've painted turn out.
Definitely. We're talking about a distribution of outcomes here. Obviously, the tails of that distribution are where it's most interesting to discuss. The middle of the distribution is where things are going to get a little bit messier and a little less interesting, and where things are probably going to end up. I do think that there is a good chance that Warsh ends up as a perfectly serviceable chair, and that some of the concerns that we have talked about end up not warranted. But ultimately, we'll find out. It's not clear when exactly we'll find out, because again, as long as Chair Powell is under investigation by the DOJ, we won't get a nomination moving through the Senate Banking Committee. So despite the fact that Warsh is now the incoming chair of the Federal Reserve, it actually moving through to being the chair of the Federal Reserve may take quite some time. And in the meantime, the leadership from Chair Powell on the committee and the rest of the FOMC, the rest of the Board of Governors, there is a lot of very calm and stable policymaking experience there. And the market really hasn't moved much because of that roster on the rest of the central bank. And, you were quoting yield moves earlier. If you just look at explicit Fed funds rate pricing, it basically hasn't moved. It's 2 more cuts this year, and that's the end of the easing cycle. And I think that is probably the most likely outcome that we get. And the market, as usual, has gotten it right.
George Pearkes, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Will.
That was George Pearkes, macro strategist with Bespoke Investment Group. I think George's framing there towards the end is helpful. There's a lot of focus on the extreme possible outcomes of what could unfold with Warsh's Fed chair, but most likely, the Fed's organizational structure and institutional guardrails will stop him from making big drastic changes, either good or bad. So there's a good chance he'll advocate for lower rates, but he's still just 1 vote of 12 on the Federal Open Market Committee, and there's still no pressing risk of the Fed losing its political independence. Similarly, his opinion on the ideal size of the balance sheet will run up against the status quo and other Fed officials' sense of how its reserve management purchases are needed to alleviate pressures in funding markets. The January jobs report, originally scheduled for release this week, has been postponed to next Wednesday, February 11th. The consensus currently expects payrolls grew 71,000 and the unemployment rate was unchanged at 4.4%. Also next week, the January CPI will be released on Friday. The shutdown last quarter is still giving artificially downward pressure on reported shelter prices, so the CPI's supercore, or core services excluding shelter, will be an important gauge for inflation momentum when accounting for housing quirks and the fading impacts from tariffs. The following week will be shortened by the President's Day holiday, but still full of tradable events. The January retail sales release starts things off on Tuesday the 17th, before the December PCE and Q4 GDP come out on Friday the 20th. Also that week, the FOMC will release the minutes from its January meeting. That's all for today's episode. Thanks again for listening. I'm Will Compernell, macro strategist with FHN Financial. This episode was edited by Bill Stanfield. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Simply Put wherever you get your podcasts. Email simplyput@fhnfinancial.com with any questions or comments. This podcast is presented for informational purposes only and is not intended as an offer or solicitation with respect to the purchase or sale of any security. Views expressed herein accurately reflect the speaker's personal views about the data, news, trends, events, etc. discussed herein or any subject securities or issuers. No part of their compensation was, is, or will be, directly or indirectly, related to any specific recommendations or views expressed. FHN Financial, through First Horizon Bank or its affiliates, offers investment products and services. Investment products are not FDIC insured, have no bank guarantee, and may lose value.